Do you know who I am? I'm Julian Thorne, Senator Marcus Thorne's son. My father already made the call, so make this quick. I have a 4 p.m. flight to Aspen.
I knew this case was going to be a problem before the bailiff even called the docket number. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a courtroom when real power walks in, not the power of the law, but the power of money and political connections. It's a heavy, suffocating silence. And on that Tuesday morning, the air in my courtroom felt like it had been sucked out of the vents the moment Julian Thorne stepped through the double doors. He was 23 years old, but he walked with the swagger of a man who owned the building. He wore a navy blue bespoke suit that fit him a little too perfectly, the kind of tailoring that costs more than my court reporter makes in 6 months. He didn't look at the bailiff, he didn't look at the clerk, and he certainly didn't look at me. He was busy adjusting a platinum cufflink on his wrist, checking his reflection in the glass partition of the defendant's box. This was Julian Thorne, the only son of Senator Marcus Thorne. And in this state, that name was supposed to be a get-out-of-jail-free card. Docket number 4,921, the clerk announced, her voice trembling slightly. State versus Julian Thorne. Charges: aggravated assault, destruction of property, and disorderly conduct. As the charges were read, I watched Julian. He let out a bored sigh, the kind of sound a teenager makes when asked to take out the trash. He pulled out a sleek, black phone and tapped the screen, completely ignoring the gravity of the room. His attorney, a man named Sterling, who charged by the minute and wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes, leaned over and whispered something. Julian chuckled. That chuckle echoed in the silence. It was the sound of immunity. I shifted my gaze to the prosecution table. Sitting there, hunched over as if trying to make himself invisible, was the victim, Mr. Elias Vance. He was 64 years old, a retired high school history teacher who now worked part-time as a valet at the very restaurant where the incident took place. The contrast was enough to make your stomach turn. Julian looked like he had just stepped off a yacht. Elias looked broken. His left arm was in a sling, and there was a dark purple bruise blossoming across his jawline that makeup couldn't hide. He held his good hand in his lap, squeezing a tissue so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't looking at Julian, he was looking at the floor, terrified. I opened the case file in front of me. The police report was brutal. It stated that on the night of October 14th, Julian Thorne had arrived at La Ciel, the city's most exclusive restaurant. When Mr. Vance, the valet, took an extra 3 minutes to retrieve Julian's sports car because of a mechanical issue with the key fob, Julian didn't just get angry, he exploded. According to 3 witnesses and security footage, Julian had screamed, "Do you know whose time you're wasting?" before striking the 64-year-old man in the face with a heavy signet ring. When Mr. Vance fell, Julian allegedly kicked him in the ribs. I looked up from the gruesome photos attached to the file photos of a battered, elderly face and looked back at the young man currently checking his cuticles in my courtroom. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice low and level. I didn't raise it. I never do. In my courtroom, the quietest voice is the most dangerous one. Is there something on your phone that is more important than the felony charges being read against you? Julian didn't jump. He didn't apologize. He slowly looked up, meeting my eyes with a look of genuine confusion, as if he was surprised I was allowed to speak to him directly. "I'm just checking my schedule, Judge," he said, his tone casual, almost friendly. "I have a flight to Aspen at 4 p.m. My lawyer said this would just be a formality. Can we speed this up?" The entire courtroom froze. The stenographer stopped typing. The bailiff's hand drifted instinctively to his belt. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cold leather against my spine. This wasn't just arrogance. This was a complete detachment from reality. He didn't see a courtroom. He saw a transaction. He didn't see a judge. He saw a clerk he needed to bypass. "A formality," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. "Yeah," Julian said, flashing a charming, practiced smile that probably worked on university deans and police officers his whole life. "My dad, the senator, said he already made a call. So I assume we're just doing the paperwork dance, right?" I looked at Mr. Vance, the victim. He had flinched when Julian mentioned his father. He shrank even further into his chair, looking like he wanted to disappear. He knew how the world worked. He knew that men like Julian usually walked away, while men like him were left with the medical bills and the trauma. But Julian Thorne had made a critical miscalculation. He thought he was walking into a negotiation. He didn't realize he had just walked into my domain. And in my domain, a senator's phone call doesn't ring. Mr. Sterling, I said to his lawyer, keeping my eyes locked on the defendant. Your client seems to be under the impression that he has a plane to catch. I suggest you advise him to cancel his ticket. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Excuse me? He said, his voice sharpening. You heard me, I said, picking up my pen. There will be no flight to Aspen today, Mr. Thorne, because we haven't even begun to discuss what you did to that man sitting 10 feet away from you. And I have a feeling that by the time we are done, the only place you'll be going is somewhere very, very uncomfortable. The air in the room shifted from fear to electricity. Julian straightened his jacket, his jaw tightening. The predator had just realized he might be the prey. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. It was a sharp, intrusive sound designed to break the tension I had just built. He stood up, smoothing the front of his Italian suit, his demeanor shifting from casual confidence to professional indignation. He knew the script, too. When the judge doesn't bow to the status, you switch to technicalities. Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice oily and smooth. With all due respect, my client has no criminal record. He is a student at the university, a member of the dean's list, and his family is, well, they are pillars of this community. The flight to Aspen is for a charity gala hosted by his mother. Keeping him here over a simple misunderstanding seems excessive. A misunderstanding, that was the word they always used. When a poor kid steals a candy bar, it's a crime. When a rich kid breaks an old man's jaw, it's a misunderstanding. I looked down at the medical report on my bench. I didn't look at Sterling. I traced the line of text that detailed the injuries. Orbital floor fracture, 3 broken ribs, concussion. Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my eyes on the paper. I'm looking at the medical report for Mr. Vance. It says here that the misunderstanding resulted in reconstructive surgery on his left eye socket. Does that sound like a misunderstanding to you? Or does it sound like a beatdown? Sterling stiffened. There are 2 sides to every story, Judge. Mr. Vance was aggressive. He mishandled my client's property. Julian felt threatened. I slowly turned my head to look at the defendant. Julian wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Elias Vance, the victim. And for the first time, I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't remorse. It was disgust. He looked at the elderly man the way one looks at a stain on a silk shirt. Threatened, I repeated. Mr. Thorne, do you feel threatened right now? Julian blinked, bringing his attention back to me. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. By him? He pointed a manicured finger at Elias, who flinched at the sudden movement. Look at him, Judge. He's a valet. He barely speaks English properly. I told him to be careful with the Porsche. It's a limited edition. He scratched the rim. Do you know how much that rim costs? The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy and dangerous. So, to be clear, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, deadlier. You struck Mr. Vance because he scratched a rim? Julian rolled his eyes, leaning forward on the defense table. I struck him because he didn't listen. People like him. They don't respect property. They don't respect time. I had to teach him a lesson. It's not a big deal. My dad already paid his medical bills. We sent a check this morning. So, can we just move on? He said it with such absolute certainty, such unwavering belief in the transaction of violence. To him, Elias's pain had a price tag, and the senator had already paid it. Therefore, the transaction was complete. I looked at Elias. The old man was shaking. A tear leaked out of his swollen eye and tracked through the bruising on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He was too afraid to move. Mr. Vance, I said gently, did you receive a check? Elias looked up, his voice barely a whisper. They threw an envelope at me in the hospital, Your Honor. They said if I didn't take it, I would lose my job. They said nobody says no to the Thorns. I felt the temperature in my veins drop to 0. This wasn't just assault. This was intimidation. This was the systematic erasure of a human being. because he was inconvenient to a powerful family. I closed the folder. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Mr. Sterling, I said, staring directly at the lawyer. You mentioned your client has no criminal record. That is about to change. And you mentioned a flight to a charity gala. I hope they can raise money without him, because I am looking at the bail recommendation here and I find it lacking. Julian's head snapped up. Bail? I'm not paying bail. I'm leaving. Oh, you are not leaving, Mr. Thorne, I said, finally allowing a sliver of the anger I felt to seep into my tone. You see, you made a mistake. You thought you bought silence. But in this room, money doesn't make noise. Evidence does. And I haven't even played the video yet. I picked up the remote for the courtroom monitor. Clerk, please play Exhibit A. I want everyone to see exactly how threatened Mr. Thorne felt. Julian's face went pale. For the first time, the armor of the senator's name developed a crack. He knew what was on that video, and he realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that Daddy wasn't holding the remote. I was. The courtroom monitor flickered to life. The footage was grainy, taken from a high-angle security camera mounted above the valet stand at La Ciel. But the clarity of the violence didn't need 4K resolution. It was brutal in its simplicity. I watched Julian's face as the video started playing. He didn't look at the screen. He looked down at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his cuff. He knew what was coming, but the rest of the room didn't. On the screen, the timestamp read 9:42 p.m. The valet stand was busy. You could see Mr. Vance, small, hunched in his uniform, running back and forth, organizing keys. Then, a sleek silver sports car pulled up. Julian Thorne stepped out. Even in the grainy black and white footage, his body language was aggressive. He threw his keys at Elias, not to him. They bounced off the old man's chest and clattered onto the pavement. A gasp rippled through the gallery. In the video, Elias bent down to pick up the keys. It took him a moment. His knees were stiff. While he was bowed, Julian kicked the bumper of his own car, gesturing wildly. He was shouting. You couldn't hear the audio, but the rage was palpable. He got right in Elias's face, pointing a finger into the old man's chest. Is this where you felt threatened, Mr. Thorne? I asked, my voice cutting through the silence of the room. When an elderly man was on his knees picking up your keys, Julian didn't answer. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. The video continued. Elias stood up, holding the keys out, seemingly apologizing. He bowed his head, a gesture of submission, and that's when it happened. Julian didn't just strike him, he wound up. It was a calculated, vicious backhand swing. The heavy ring on his finger caught the light just before it connected with Elias's jaw. The old man went down like he'd been shot. He didn't crumble. He stiffened and fell backward, his head bouncing off the concrete with a sickening jolt that made the stenographer cover her mouth. But Julian wasn't done. As Elias lay there, motionless, Julian stepped over him. He didn't check a pulse. He didn't call for help. He delivered a sharp kick to the man's ribs, then leaned down and shouted something into the unconscious face of his victim before snatching his keys from the limp hand. The video ended. The screen went black. For 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The silence wasn't just heavy anymore. It was hostile. The gallery, which had been murmuring about the senator's son just minutes ago, was now staring at a monster. I turned my chair slowly to face the defendant. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, you told this court that your client felt threatened. You said Mr. Vance was aggressive. Sterling was pale. He loosened his tie, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Your Honor, the footage, it lacks context. There were words exchanged prior to context, I interrupted, slamming my hand down on the desk. The sound made Julian jump. The context is that your client sucker punched a senior citizen who was apologizing to him. The context is that he kicked a man who was already down. That is not self-defense. That is sadism. I looked at Julian. The arrogance was slipping, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He looked at the gallery, realizing that the public opinion had just shifted violently against him. You said he didn't respect your time, I said to Julian. You said you had to teach him a lesson. Well, Mr. Thorne, school is now in session, and I have a feeling you are not going to like the curriculum. I was drunk, Julian stammered suddenly, grasping for a new excuse. I had too much to drink at dinner. I didn't know what I was doing. It's not who I am. It's exactly who you are, I countered coldly. Alcohol doesn't invent violence, Mr. Thorne. It reveals it. And what it revealed is a bully who thinks his last name is a shield. I picked up a document from the top of the stack, and speaking of your last name, let's talk about that phone call your father made. Because according to this new report I just received from the prosecutor, that wasn't the only call made that night. Julian's eyes went wide. He looked at Sterling, but his lawyer was busy staring at his shoes. The arresting officer, I continued, reading from the paper, claims that while Mr. Vance was being loaded into the ambulance, you told the police, and I quote, "My dad will have your badges by morning if you touch me." Is that correct? Julian swallowed hard. I was upset. I didn't mean it. You didn't mean it? I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. Then why did the precinct receive a call from the senator's office 10 minutes later asking for the charges to be dropped? The room gasped again. This was the bombshell. I wasn't just putting Julian on trial anymore. I was putting the entire system on trial. And I was about to light a match. Sterling was on his feet before the echo of my words had even faded. Objection, Your Honor, this is hearsay. This is an attempt to prejudice the court against my client based on unverified gossip about his father. We are here to discuss a simple assault charge, not a political conspiracy. Simple assault, I repeated, letting the words taste like ash in my mouth. There is nothing simple about a fractured orbital floor, counselor. And as for prejudice, your client introduced his father into this courtroom, not me. He is the one who used the senator's name as a weapon against the police. I am simply establishing the blast radius. Sterling opened his mouth to argue, but the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud thud. It wasn't a spectator. It was the court administrator, Mr. Henderson, a nervous man who rarely left his office on the first floor unless the building was on fire. He walked hurriedly down the center aisle, clutching a folded piece of paper. The rhythm of his steps was frantic, the sound of bureaucratic panic. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked straight at me, his eyes wide with apology and fear. Julian saw him, too, and for the first time in 10 minutes, the color returned to his cheeks. He recognized the machinery of influence at work. He sat up straighter, shooting a look at Sterling that said, "See, I told you he handled it." Henderson reached the bench. He didn't speak. He just slid the note across the mahogany surface, his hand lingering for a moment as if he wanted to snatch it back. From the chief judge, he whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch the tremor in his voice. He said, "It's urgent." Regarding the Thorne case, I looked at the note. I didn't open it immediately. I looked at Julian. He was smiling again, that same sickening, entitled smile from the start of the hearing. He thought the cavalry had arrived. He thought the rules were about to bend, just like they always did. He thought I was about to be put back in my box. I unfolded the paper. It was short, typed on official letterhead. Defense has filed an emergency motion for recusal, citing bias. Suggest you grant it and transfer the case to Judge Miller. Let's not make this a circus, Boyd. Judge Miller, the senator's golf partner. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, filtered down from the senator, through the chief judge to me. They wanted me off the case. They wanted a friendlier face on the bench, someone who understood the formality of letting a Thorne walk free. I folded the note slowly, creasing the edge with my thumbnail until it was sharp enough to cut. The sound of the paper folding was the only noise in the room. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, "please inform the chief judge that his suggestion has been noted." Julian's smile widened. He started to reach for his leather bag, assuming the dismissal or the transfer was coming. He was already checking his watch, calculating if he could still make the flight. And I continued, staring directly at the defendant, freezing him in place. "Inform him that I am declining the request. This court is in session. I am the presiding judge, and I am not going anywhere." Julian froze. His hand hovered over his bag. The smile died a violent death. "You can't do that," Sterling sputtered, losing his composure entirely. We filed a formal motion. The chief judge is not sitting in this chair, Mr. Sterling. I shot back, my voice like a whip. I am, and I am biased against criminals who think they own the law. Right now, your client is looking less like a student and more like a flight risk with powerful accomplices. So, let's talk about that flight to Aspen again. I picked up my gavel. It felt heavier than usual, weighted with the decision I was about to make. A decision that would likely end my career, but would save my conscience. Bail, I announced. The prosecution requested $5,000. Given the new information regarding the defendant's resources and his explicit attempts to intimidate law enforcement, that number is insufficient. I looked Julian in the eye. Mr. Thorne, do you have your checkbook handy? Because the price of admission just went up, and I promise you, your father cannot write a check big enough to stop what happens next. Sterling looked like he was trying to swallow a lemon whole. He was sweating now, a visible sheen on his forehead that betrayed the absolute collapse of his strategy. He had played the good family card. He had played the misunderstanding card. He had even tried to play the political pressure card via the chief judge, and I had just set fire to the entire deck. Your Honor, Sterling stammered, his voice losing its polished veneer. A cash bail increase is punitive. My client is a student. He is a resident of this state. He is not a flight risk. Not a flight risk? I repeated, leaning over the bench. Mr. Sterling, 5 minutes ago, your client bragged about a 4 p.m. flight to Aspen. He literally has a boarding pass in his pocket. If that is not the definition of a flight risk, I don't know what is. I turned my gaze to Julian. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at the exit sign, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He looked like an animal, realizing the cage door was about to swing shut. Furthermore, I continued, the prosecution has presented evidence that the defendant attempted to use his family's influence to intimidate the arresting officers and the victim. That suggests a risk of obstruction of justice. And in my court, obstruction is not treated lightly. Julian slammed his hand on the table. I didn't obstruct anything. I just made a phone call. That's my right. Your right? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Mr. Thorne, you seem to confuse rights with privileges. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. Because every time you open your mouth, the price of your freedom goes up. I looked down at the docket. I picked up my pen. The scratching sound of the nib against the paper was loud in the silent room. Bail is set at $500,000, I announced. A gasp went through the gallery. Sterling's jaw dropped. 500,000? Your Honor, that is exorbitant. For a simple assault charge? Aggravated assault, I corrected sharply, with intent to cause great bodily harm, and I am not finished. I looked directly at Julian. Bail is set at $500,000, cash only. No bondsman, no property collateral, cash. Today, Julian scoffed. Fine, my dad will wire it in an hour. Is that it? Can I go now? He still didn't get it. He thought money was the punishment. He thought that by writing a check, he was buying his way out of the inconvenience. He was treating the judicial system like a vending machine. No, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register again. That is not it. Because money means nothing to you, does it? It's just numbers on a screen. So, to ensure the safety of this community and the integrity of this court, I am imposing additional conditions. I turned to the bailiff. Officer, please approach the defendant. The bailiff, a large man who had been watching Julian's antics with thinly veiled distaste, stepped forward. The jingle of handcuffs on his belt was unmistakable. Condition number 1, I said, surrender of passport. You are grounded, Mr. Thorne. No Aspen, no Paris, no escape. Julian's face flushed red. You can't take my passport. I have a trip to Europe next month. Cancel it, I said. Condition number 2. You are to have absolutely no contact with the victim, Mr. Vance. If you so much as sneeze in his direction, if your father makes one more phone call to his employer, I will revoke your bail and throw you in a cell until trial. Do you understand? This is ridiculous, Julian shouted, standing up. My father is a senator. You are going to lose your job for this. There it was. The threat, the final desperate swing of a man who had never been told no. Sit down, I roared. The force of my voice made Julian collapse back into his chair. And condition number 3, I said, my voice returning to an icy calm. Since you seem to have a problem with authority and impulse control, I am ordering that you be remanded to custody immediately until the cash bail is posted and the passport is physically surrendered to the clerk of court. Remanded? Julian whispered, the word foreign to him. What does that mean? It means, I said, pointing to the bailiff, that you are not walking out of those double doors, Mr. Thorne. You are walking out of that side door. In handcuffs, the bailiff unhooked the cuffs from his belt. The metallic click-click was the loudest sound in the world. Julian looked at the cuffs, then at me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Wait, he said, his voice trembling. You can't put me in jail. I'm wearing a $3,000 suit. I can't go in there with them. Then I suggest you don't drop the soap, I said, reaching for my gavel. Bailiff, take him into custody. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut is universal. It doesn't matter what language you speak or how much money is in your bank account. That mechanical click translates to the same thing. Your autonomy is gone. For Julian Thorne, that sound was the death knell of his entire worldview. When the bailiff reached for his left wrist, the one adorned with a platinum watch that probably cost more than the bailiff's car, Julian recoiled as if he had been burned. Don't touch me, he shrieked, scrambling backward, knocking his expensive leather chair over. It hit the floor with a loud clatter that echoed off the high ceilings. Sterling, do something. He's touching me. Sterling didn't move. He stood there, clutching his briefcase, looking pale and defeated. He knew the law. Once a judge says remanded, the debate is over. The physical force of the state takes over. Julian, please, Sterling hissed, his voice tight. Don't resist. You're making it worse. I'm calling your father right now. Just go with him. Go with him? Julian shouted, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. To jail? Are you insane? I am Julian Thorne. I do not go to jail. The bailiff, a veteran officer named Miller who had spent 20 years dealing with people far tougher than a pampered frat boy, didn't waste time debating philosophy. He stepped into Julian's personal space with practiced efficiency. He grabbed Julian's arm, spun him around, and forced his hands behind his back. Julian let out a gasp of pain and indignity. You're hurting me. This is police brutality. I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone in this room. You can file the paperwork from your cell, Miller said flatly, snapping the second cuff onto Julian's right wrist. I watched from the bench, my face impassive. It is a strange thing to watch a man who believes he is a god suddenly realize he is mortal. The arrogance drained out of Julian instantly, replaced by the raw, animalistic fear of a child lost in the dark. He wasn't a senator's son anymore. He was just inmate number pending. As Miller began to march him toward the side door, the heavy steel door that leads to the holding cells, Julian's legs gave out. He didn't faint, but his knees buckled under the weight of the reality crashing down on him. Miller had to hold him up by the arm of his $3,000 suit, dragging him slightly. Julian twisted his head back, his eyes wild, scanning the room for a savior. He looked at Sterling. He looked at the gallery. And finally, he looked at me. You're making a mistake, he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. Do you hear me? You're done. My dad will bury you. You're nothing. You're nobody. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I held his gaze until the heavy door opened. The sounds from the other side, the distant clanging of bars, the shouting of other inmates, the smell of bleach and misery wafted into the courtroom for a brief second. Julian stared into that abyss. The abyss stared back. No, he whimpered. Please, I'm sorry. I'll pay. I'll pay double. Just don't put me in there. Please. Miller shoved him through the doorway. The heavy steel door slammed shut with a finality that vibrated through the floorboards. Clang. And just like that, the monster was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the suffocating silence of power that had started the hearing. It was the stunned silence of shock. The air felt lighter, cleaner. I slowly turned my attention away from the door and looked down at the prosecution table. Elias Vance was sitting there, his mouth slightly open. He was staring at the space where Julian had been standing just moments ago. He looked like he had just seen a ghost, or perhaps a miracle. Mr. Vance, I said softly. Elias jumped, looking up at me with his one good eye. Are you all right? He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he reached up to touch the bruise on his face. He's gone? Elias whispered, as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. He actually went inside? He is in custody, I confirmed. And he will remain there until he learns that the law applies to everyone, even to those with the last name Thorne. Elias slumped back in his chair, and for the first time, I saw the tension leave his shoulders. He began to weep, not out of fear this time, but out of relief. It was the sound of a man who had spent his whole life being invisible, finally being seen. But I knew the war wasn't over. I had won the battle in the courtroom, but the real fight was just beginning. I looked at Sterling, who was frantically typing on his phone, undoubtedly updating the senator on the disaster. Mr. Sterling, I said. The lawyer jumped, nearly dropping his phone. Yes, Your Honor. You have a phone call to make, I said, picking up my files to signal the end of the session. Tell the senator that bail is set. Tell him his son is safe in state custody. And tell him, I paused, looking Sterling dead in the eye. Tell him that if he wants his son back, he can come to my courtroom and explain why he thought he could buy it. The courtroom doors didn't just open this time. They were thrown wide with a violence that rattled the frames. If Julian's entrance had been an act of arrogance, Senator Marcus Thorne's entrance was an act of war. He didn't walk, he marched. He was flanked by two men in dark suits who weren't police, private security, the kind that cost a fortune and didn't ask questions. The senator looked exactly like he did on the campaign posters. Silver hair perfectly coiffed, jawline set in stone, a charcoal suit that commanded respect. But up close, from the vantage point of the bench, I saw the cracks. I saw the red flush in his neck. I saw the vein pulsing in his temple. And I smelled the faint, metallic scent of a man who was terrified of losing control. Sterling practically leaped over the defense table to intercept him. Senator, please, we can't. Thorne shoved his own lawyer aside without even looking at him. He didn't look at Elias Vance. He didn't look at the empty defendant's chair. He looked straight at me. Where is he? Thorne's voice was a deep baritone, practiced in committee hearings and televised debates. But here, it echoed off the walls with a raw, ugly edge. I want to know where you put my son, Boyd, and I want to know why my chief of staff tells me you're holding him on a $500,000 ransom. The gallery murmured. This was unprecedented. A sitting senator storming a courtroom to demand the release of a prisoner. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned forward, interlacing my fingers on the desk. Senator Thorne, I said calmly, you are currently standing in the well of a court of law. Unless you have a law license and are entering an appearance on the record, I suggest you step back behind the bar immediately. Thorne scoffed, walking right up to the bench. He placed both hands on the wood, leaning in close. It was an intimidation tactic, one that probably worked on lobbyists and junior congressmen. Don't quote procedure to me, he hissed, low enough that the gallery couldn't hear the specific words, but loud enough for me. Do you have any idea what you've just done? You just ended your career. I appointed the judges who appointed the committee that reviews your tenure. You are done. Now, bring Julian out, apologize, and maybe I'll let you keep your pension. I looked at his hands on my bench. I looked at his face, twisted with the absolute certainty that he was the law, and I was just a clerk with a gavel. Are you finished? I asked. Thorne blinked, taken aback by the lack of fear in my voice. Excuse me? Are you finished threatening a judicial officer on the record? I pointed to the court reporter, whose fingers were flying across the stenotype machine, capturing every syllable. Because everything you just said is being transcribed, and I'm sure the ethics committee and the voters would be fascinated to read how Senator Thorne treats the separation of powers. Thorne's eyes darted to the stenographer, then back to me. He pulled his hands off the bench as if it were hot. This is a misunderstanding, he said, his voice shifting instantly, trying to regain the politician's mask. I am a concerned father. My son has health issues. He is fragile. Jail is not a suitable environment for him. Mr. Vance has health issues too, I interrupted, gesturing to the elderly valet who was watching the scene with wide, terrified eyes. He has a fractured eye socket. He has 3 broken ribs. He is 64 years old, and your fragile son kicked him while he was unconscious on the pavement. Thorne finally looked at Elias. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of recognition, not of Elias as a person, but of Elias as a liability, a problem to be managed. We settled that, Thorne said dismissively. We paid him. It's a civil matter. It is a criminal matter, I corrected. And right now, Senator, you are perilously close to becoming part of it. Your son attempted to use your office to obstruct justice. He told the police you would take their badges. And now, here you are, threatening to take my job. It seems the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Thorne straightened up, buttoning his jacket. The charm was gone. The mask was off. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes. You're enjoying this, he said quietly. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a small man in a small room. You have my son for tonight. Fine. But by tomorrow morning, the appellate court will overrule this ridiculous bail. And by next week, you'll be reassigned to traffic court in the basement. You picked the wrong family, Boyd. Perhaps, I said, picking up a file. Or perhaps you picked the wrong courtroom. Because there is one thing you forgot to check before you stormed in here, Senator. And what is that? Thorne sneered. I pointed a finger toward the back corner of the room, up near the ceiling. A small red light was blinking on a mounted camera. This courtroom is part of the new Transparency and Justice pilot program, I said, allowing myself a very small, very cold smile. We are live streaming. Right now, to the public access channel and the court's website. Thorne froze. He turned slowly to look at the camera. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. You mean, there are currently about 3,000 people watching you threaten a judge and dismiss the assault of an elderly veteran. I checked the monitor on my desk. Oh, wait, it's trending. 5,000 people. Thorne looked at me, then at Sterling, then at the camera. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't in control. He was the villain in a movie he didn't know was being filmed. Bailiff, I said, my voice ringing out with finality. Please escort the senator out. He is disrupting the proceedings, and if he resists, treat him exactly like you would anyone else. Senator Thorne didn't march out. He retreated. He backed away from the bench, shielding his face from the camera lens with an instinctual, pathetic gesture, before turning and practically running down the center aisle. His security detail scrambled to keep up, their earpieces useless against the tsunami of public scrutiny that was currently crashing down on their boss's career. The double doors swung shut. The red light on the camera kept blinking. The number on my monitor, the viewer count, jumped to 8,000. I looked down at Mr. Sterling. The high-priced attorney was standing alone at the defense table, his client in a cell, his patron in a panic, and his career likely in tatters. He looked like a man who had brought a knife to a nuclear war. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice calm, the adrenaline fading into a steady resolve. Do you have any further motions? Perhaps another family member you'd like to invite to threaten the court? Sterling shook his head slowly, closing his briefcase. No, Your Honor. We accept the bail conditions. Good, I said. Then we are adjourned. But before I banged the gavel, I turned to Elias Vance. The elderly valet was still sitting there, clutching his tissue, looking at the empty space where the senator had stood. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Mr. Vance, I said. The room went deadly quiet. I want you to hear this. In this building, your time is worth just as much as a senator's. Your safety is worth just as much as a billionaire's. And your dignity is not for sale. Elias nodded, a single tear tracking through the bruising on his cheek. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, Judge. I picked up the gavel. The wood felt solid, real, unlike the illusion of power the Thorns had tried to project. This court is in recess, I announced. Bang. The sound was crisp and final. As I stood up and walked toward my chambers, I didn't look back at the gallery. I didn't check the live stream comments. I didn't need to. I knew what had happened today. Julian Thorne had walked in thinking the law was a negotiation. He was sitting in a holding cell right now, learning that it is actually a wall. Senator Thorne had walked in thinking he was the author of the story. He left, realizing he was just a character in mine. I took off my robe and hung it on the hook behind the door. The smell of expensive perfume and fear had finally dissipated from the courtroom, replaced by the only scent that matters in my line of work, the scent of consequences.